In this second video from chapter 13, we will be looking at family roles and relationships within family systems. So we can think of the family as a dynamic system, meaning that it's constantly changing and evolving. It's made up of the individuals within and the relationships of these individuals will develop and change over time. Um, and within this family system, there's often, various subsystems. So, the children make up a subsystem and the parents make up another subsystem. And, you could look at the males as forming a subsystem within the overall family and the females forming another subsystem. So there are, a number of different, systems within the whole family system. And this family system is also embedded in the larger context of society and culture, which is going to help to shape its form and function. So the family system is going to work differently in one culture or one society versus another. So there are all sorts of influences within the family, and then there are the external environmental influences that affect the whole system as well. Okay, the changing roles of mothers and fathers, and let's go on here. Research, well, actually, before I get there, one concern has been about the effects of maternal employment, particularly on infants and young children, um, compared to uh, generations from 50 years ago. I mean, we're in a very different type of society where typically, in most cases, both parents do some form of work outside the home, um, and so at some point there was concern that now that mothers have started working and that they're not staying at home with their young children, how is this going to affect the young children, and particularly with such issues as forming a secure attachment. So this has been researched quite a bit because of these concerns, and research, as it says here, has failed to find consistent differences between children with mothers who work outside the home and those whose mothers do not work outside. So the overall finding has been that just because the mother works does not have significant impact on um, the relationships that develop between young children or infants and the mother. So the the one um, the one situation where it really does have an impact is if the mother's work is particularly stressful and demanding and therefore affects her time at home. And if she comes home like stressed out and in a bad mood because of hardships at work, for instance, obviously that can affect her parenting. But just because a mother may be working in a full-time job, and what's really important is that when she is with her infant or young child, that she is a sensitive and caring mother. And so as long as the work isn't affecting that, it doesn't the research shows it doesn't matter that she may be gone for significant periods of time during the week while she's at work. It's all about the quality of the mother child relationship while she is at home. It's fine that the child may be at a daycare or a child care during the day, or with a sitter, or another family member. It's all about the mother being once again a sensitive and caring caregiver while she is at home in the evenings or the weekends or whatever it may be. Okay. One thing that certainly has changed is the percentage of stay at home fathers, um, and in particular, the ones that are staying at home because, by choice, because they want to be a primary caregiver and then care for the home or the family. So, we're talking about stay-at-home fathers here, and you can see that there's been, a 4 times increase from 1989 to 2012. Just looking at that those top yellow sections. In 1989, there was only 5% of fathers that were purposely staying at home in order to care for the family, and it was up to 21% of the stay-at-home fathers saying that was the main reason that they were at home in 2012. And so it has become much more common that fathers may choose to be at home because they want to be a primary caregiver in their young child's life. And there's many families now where the mother may have more employment skills or be able to make significantly more money than the father, and in many cases it just makes sense. I myself was a stay-at-home father for a number of years when I was a step parent, because I was coming out of graduate school, and my wife at the time was well established in her career, and it made sense to me for me to stay at home and look after the house and the children, and it was something I really enjoyed doing. So this has become much more common than it was in earlier generations, and certainly if you go before, previous to 1989, I mean, it was up to 5% there. It would have been, even much lower if you go another 10 or 20 years earlier. It was at some point it was kind of unheard of that a father would be the one choosing to stay at home to raise his children. There are more single parent families are certainly headed by mothers. We talked about this in the last video, and unfortunately, in many cases, it's with little or no involvement of fathers. When there is a single parent mother, there's many cases where fathers, after they split up, become more distant or and do very little, show very little involvement with the children. Obviously, that's not always the case, but now they find that married fathers are more involved with the children than in the past. Involved fathers with positive parenting skills foster greater cognitive skills, self-control, and empathy, and less gender stereotyping. There are obviously benefits to both parents being heavily involved with their children. Children learn different things from their fathers than from their mothers, and so the combination of both parents being actively involved in the raising of the children is the best possible situation. Okay, let me go on here. Relationships with siblings. As it says here, about 80% of children in the U.S. have at least one sibling. So it's very common, obviously. Contextual factors such as gender, age, and family structure may influence the nature of these relationships. There are vast differences in sibling relationships as to how close siblings become, how whether they get along or not. I mean, they've done research asking siblings about their relationships, and it ranges from some siblings like absolutely, detesting their siblings to other siblings just loving and saying that they're the closest people to them. And so you get a whole range of different relationships. In research on sibling relationships, one of the main assumptions for much of the research has been that siblings share the same environment. Because if they're not, let's say they're not that far apart in age, they grow up in the same household. Siblings, they grow up with the same parents. They will often attend the same schools. They go to the same playground. I mean, like they're in the same community. They have the same neighbors. I mean, like the assumption was always, well, when siblings grow up, like they have the environmental influences are equal for both of the siblings. Let's say a couple of siblings a few years apart. And that the one that's 3 years younger, let's say, that they grow up in the same environment that the older sibling grew up in. And this was the assumption, which really turned out not to be true. And we thought because of that assumption, siblings should be similar in many characteristics because they're growing up in the same house with the same parents and going to the same school, and they may end up with the same teachers, even like that they should have all these similarities. But it turns out that this is not so true. And this is because of what we call non-shared environments. Um, so non-shared environments refer to the different experiences that siblings in the same family have within that family system. And uh, and this was often minimized in the past. That we thought the siblings would have basically the same kind of upbringing and same, they would have the same influences. But what we found is that siblings have very different influences, even though they're in the same household or have the same parents. Uh, where am I going here? One explanation for why siblings have such different experiences is that each sibling is born into the family at a different point in the family timeline. So the environment is somewhat different for each sibling. So, I talked about siblings being a few years apart. Sure, they might grow up in the same house, but and with the same parents, but the parents may have changed quite a bit, you know, from when they're from how they raise the first child to how they're, raising the second child and how they interact with the second child. So, we a lot of research shows that parents are often more strict with their firstborn, and they're kind of uptight. They want to do everything right. They have rules that they try to follow with the child, and that as parents have more children, that they tend to relax more, and they kind of take an easier attitude towards each child that comes along, that they kind of lessen up with being as strict with rules and things like that. And so even though the grown children are growing up with the same parents, they're growing up at different times. So the parents have changed, from one child to another. And we say that, yeah, they might be growing up in the same house, but that house may be very different when one child's, in their preschool years than when the next child's growing up through their preschool years. I mean, there may have been, changes within the household, that maybe their income level has changed. There might be more, toys or books in the house, or, different, and also, families also move. So to think that they're growing up in going to the same schools or having the same teachers or having the same playgrounds, that's not always true either. So we had this assumption that, you know, children in the same household have the same influences, and we have found out since that non-shared environments are critical. That it turns out each sibling, really gets a lot of different influences. The parents never treat every child exactly the same, right? And so they get different experiences, and they're also going to have different peer groups if they're a few years apart. And so we found that these non-shared environments, you know, really is what accounts for the differences that you see between siblings. And as anyone knows, if you know, you might think about your own siblings or other, siblings in other families that, like siblings are often very, very different. I'm very different than my sister, and very different than my brother that's only a couple of years older, and we've had a lot of different life experiences, and I think we had different experiences growing up. So this we no longer consider siblings within a family to have the same environment, and it's even true for, you might think about, well, what about twins? I mean, like, even twins are treated differently, even though they're born at the same time, they're the same age. they have a lot of non-shared experiences, environments as well. Um, Studies show that the parents never treat each twin equally. They tend to exaggerate any differences between them. Oh, you know, John's more outgoing than Bill is, and John likes this, and Bill really likes this, and they like when they find differences between their twins, they kind of exaggerate them and treat them differently, based on their differences. So, anyways, this is the concept of non-shared environments and why siblings can turn out very, very different from one another. Okay, there's little evidence for differences by birth order. Birth order used to be a very hot topic at one time in psychology. You got to go pretty far back, but certainly, like in the first half of the 1900s, there was tons of research about what it means to be a firstborn versus a secondborn versus a lastborn. And that it used to be seen as something that would be very significant in how children turn out. But large-scale studies on the effect of birth order that on the effect that birth order has on personality characteristics have not consistently confirmed differences. And the reason is that there are so many other factors at play besides, like, were you a firstborn or a secondborn or a thirdborn, or the baby of the family. I mean, like, it doesn't mean that there isn't any effect of birth order, but they are far less significant than other factors that can affect children and affect their personalities. So I've mentioned that parents often treat children differently they treat different children differently. And it's because, once again, remember, the parents have changed between each child. The parents are new. They are not the same people that they were 3 years earlier when they had their first child. They're 3 years later, they're very different. They're going to raise that infant differently, and raise them differently as they become a toddler, and so the family is constantly, remember, it's dynamic. It's constantly evolving and changing, and so it's not uncommon that there is differential parental treatment of different children within the family system. Sometimes differential treatment of siblings within the same family can cause conflict. If one sibling feels like they're treated harsher than another, that can be very upsetting to them, and it can at times cause problems. But sometimes conflict comes from that. If one sibling believes another one is getting easier treatment, but what they find is that if the child who receives less attention or is treated more harshly by the parents, if they can see the differential treatment as legitimate or justified for some reason, it tends not to bother them. So as an example, let's say you're in a family and you have a sibling who has let's say, developmental delays, or some kind of, I don't know, let's say your sibling is autistic, for instance, just as an example. I mean, you as a sibling would not feel put out that this child might receive more attention. You would understand that it's justified, that this child needs more caregiving or needs more attention at times. And so when a child can understand why they might have more expectations placed on them, or they're treated somewhat harsher or receive less attention, it tends to be fine with children once they understand the reasoning for it. And finally, only children. At one time, only children had a very bad rap, and many people still believe the myth. There are a lot of more only children than ever now. More parents are choosing just to have one child. There was a time where it was frowned upon in society. Like, what do you mean you only have one child? Like, couldn't you have another one? Like, anyways, so we have over 15 million one-child households in the U.S. The myth that has been around for a long time is that children who grow up without siblings tend to be more self-centered, maladjusted, lonely, and neurotic than children who have siblings. Like I said, it's a bad rap. Oh, you have an only child. I bet you they're spoiled or they're a spoiled brat. Like that was kind of the stereotype. And this it is a myth, and it's research has shown it simply is not true. In fact, children with no siblings show high achievement, good adjustment, strong character, and positive social relationships. And so the majority of research shows positive benefits rather than negative benefits of growing up as an only child. I do believe, though, that parents have to make special effort in the socialization of the child, and make special efforts to arrange, more play dates and things like that, where they do spend significant time around other children. And that will conclude part 2 of chapter 13, looking at family systems.